The ballroom at Ashbourne Hall was vibrant with candlelight and the shimmering strains of a waltz when the Duchess of Kensington did the utterly unexpected. She had stood beside Lady Constance for nearly an hour, her champagne untouched, her expression pleasant and entirely unreadable. Around her, Derbyshire's most prominent families had arranged themselves in the precise geometry of social aspiration. Unmarried daughters clustered near the orchestra, matrons lined the far wall, and men formed groups that revolved not around music, but around wealth, property, and the unspoken progress of the social season. The room smelled of beeswax and hothouse roses, with a subtle, warm human undertone, as 300 candles patiently held back the August darkness. At the eastern edge of the room, where a marble column cast a slender shadow over the parquet, stood a man who had not been asked to dance since the first set concluded 2 hours prior. He was not unattractive. He was not forgettable if one bothered to truly observe him, which no one did. He simply was not the kind of man anyone thought to notice, and he had accepted this with the quiet precision of someone who understood that acceptance was distinct from surrender. Then the Duchess moved, not towards Lord Hargreave, whose railway fortune fueled at least 3 separate conversations that evening, not towards the host, who had hopefully cleared his throat when the music shifted key. She moved across the entire width of the ballroom floor, 30 feet of polished oak under 100 watchful gazes, and stopped before the man by the column. She met his gaze. He met hers. Neither spoke. She extended her hand, palm upward, the emerald of her earrings catching the nearest candle's glow. The orchestra continued to play. Every other sound in the room fell silent. From the balcony above, observers watched. They always watched. That was the purpose of a gallery at a country house ball. It was the theatre's upper tier, where those who had already performed their parts came to witness the acts that would be discussed for months to come. From that vantage, the scene unfolded. A woman in deep blue silk standing in a cone of silence she seemed oblivious to, her hand extended, her posture impeccably straight. A man looking at her hand, then at her face, with the expression of someone attempting to calculate something for which he had received no prior warning. He took her hand. They stepped onto the floor. They danced. And from that evening forward, nothing was quite the same arrangement it had been before. A widow who believed herself beyond surprise. A soldier they had all chosen to overlook. One dance. 100 witnesses. Every expectation society had molded into the lives of both, quietly unraveling in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening from tonight? I read every single one. She had arrived at Ashbourne Hall the day before, in a pale green travelling dress that felt, as she stepped from the carriage onto the gravel drive, rather like wearing someone else's certainty. 2 years, 3 months, and 11 days had passed since the Duke of Kensington's death. She did not count the days out of grief. She had loved her husband with loyalty and respect, which was precisely what their marriage had been, and what she had always been told love looked like when properly performed by people of their station. She had not wept when he died. She had been kinder to herself about that since then than she once might have been. A woman who marries at 19 for family obligation and never once questions what else might exist for her cannot be expected to transform overnight simply because the obligation has been lifted. She was 31. Her black mourning attire had transitioned to half-mourning, and then, at Constance's insistent urging, to something approaching colour once more. The pale green dress was the most assertive garment she had worn in 3 years. It did not yet feel natural. She considered that perhaps natural was an overrated standard. Ashbourne Hall embodied everything August in Derbyshire promised. Grey stone softened by a summer kinder than expected, the rose garden still heavy with late blooms, the air carrying the distinct scent of cut grass and warm stone, and subtly underneath it all the first cool whisper of approaching September. The house teemed with guests. Genevieve had heard their carriages and voices from the moment her own had turned off the main road. Constance had found her before her luggage was fully unloaded. "Lord Hargreave has taken the East Suite," Constance murmured. No greeting, no inquiry about her journey. "He arrived yesterday morning. His circumstances have improved considerably since the Northern Rail expansion. You will want to know that." "I will want a cup of tea," Genevieve said pleasantly, "and then I will want to find Clara and tell her she is going to be magnificent tomorrow." Constance's smile was the kind that did not reach her eyes. "Of course, dear." The hall's entrance hall smelled of fresh flowers and beeswax and the accumulated warmth of a house that had been receiving guests for 3 days. Clara Wynne, tomorrow to become Clara Aldridge, had found Genevieve at the foot of the staircase and embraced her with a warmth that Genevieve had not expected to feel so much relief at receiving. They had known each other since childhood, a friendship sustained across marriages, distances, and the particular awkwardness of one woman becoming a duchess while the other remained simply, entirely herself. "You look wonderful," Clara said, as friends do. "You look like someone who is one night away from the happiest day of her life," Genevieve said, which was the truth. Clara laughed, and the green dress felt slightly more manageable. It was not until dinner that Genevieve first saw Rafferty Stanhope. He was seated 6 places down the table from her, between 2 guests deeply engrossed in conversation with those on their other sides, leaving him in a small, unremarkable island of quiet. He did not appear to mind. He was speaking with Mrs. Aldridge, Hugh's mother, with what appeared to be genuine attention, leaning slightly forward, his dark eyes steady on the older woman's face as she described something about her late husband's garden. He was not feigning interest. He simply was interested. There was a scar at his left temple, pale against his skin, no larger than a thumbnail. He was, she noticed with a detachment that did not last, quietly handsome in a way that only revealed itself if one chose to look. She looked away. She was not entirely certain why she looked back. The morning of the wedding dawned grey and bright, the kind of English August morning that cannot decide between clouds and sun and ends up being both simultaneously, the light falling across Ashbourne's stone walls in alternating silver and gold. Genevieve dressed with care. Her lady's maid arranged her hair, chestnut waves pinned and styled for a formal occasion, the emerald earrings her mother had left her, the morning dress of deep lavender silk that was respectful without being funereal. She stood before the mirror when it was done and observed her reflection, a woman of 31 in appropriate attire attending a country house wedding, not a woman on display, which was what Constance had intended when she had packed that particular dress. The distinction mattered to her, even when no one else could perceive it. She descended for breakfast. Lord Hargreave was already at the table, speaking at length about the construction of a new railway line through the Midlands. He was not an unpleasant man. He was 52, broad-shouldered, with a full moustache and the satisfied air of someone who had worked diligently for a very long time and now expected the world to acknowledge that fact. He nodded at Genevieve when she entered. She nodded back and sat at the far end of the table, where Mrs. Aldridge was quietly and efficiently attending to a soft-boiled egg. "He asked about you last evening," Mrs. Aldridge said without looking up. "Did he?" "He did. I told him you were a woman of considerable intelligence and a very small appetite for being managed." Mrs. Aldridge looked up then, her eyes bright with something almost mischievous. He seemed to take that as encouragement. "Men like Lord Hargreave generally do," Genevieve said, reaching for the teapot. Rafferty Stanhope entered as she was pouring. He paused at the doorway for a moment, surveyed the table with the brief efficiency of a man assessing terrain, and chose a chair near the window, neither too close to the conversation nor ostentatiously separate. He went to the sideboard and served himself, and before he sat down she noticed him pause and reposition the serving spoon that had slipped from its dish, setting it straight before anyone else would need it. A small thing, entirely unnecessary, the kind of thing most people would not do because most people would not notice it. She noticed it. She looked down at her teacup and thought about it longer than was perhaps warranted. She had known men who had served in the army. The late Duke had maintained friendships with several, and she had met them across a decade of dinners and house parties, men who wore their service in various ways, some with great noise and some with careful silence. She had learned over those years to discern the different forms. Rafferty Stanhope wore his with the particular quietness of a man who had been through something profound and had emerged on the other side, no longer needing anyone else to validate the experience. It was, she found herself thinking, a quality very much like integrity. Not performed, simply present. He looked up and caught her eye across the breakfast table. She did not look away quickly. Neither did he. "Good morning, Your Grace," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Stanhope." The words were simple and proper, and contained on both sides a quality of attention that was rather more than simple or proper. Then Lord Hargreave interjected something about tunnel engineering, and the moment passed, reabsorbed into the general business of breakfast. They did not speak again before the wedding, but she was aware of him, the way one is aware of an unexpected sound in a quiet house, not alarming, simply present in a way that would not be easily dismissed. The morning progressed towards the ceremony, with the particular momentum of a country house operating in a state of organized anticipation. She walked with Clara to the chapel in a small group of women, listening to the laughter, nervous excitement, and Clara's mother's final instructions about the angle of the veil. The chapel was ancient, older than the house itself, its stone interior dark and cool, smelling of centuries, tallow, and a floral scent that the morning's arrangements had softly layered over everything. Light filtered through the narrow windows in the specific colour of morning glass in England, not gold, not quite white, but something held between the two. She sat in the third pew and watched Hugh Aldridge wait at the altar for his bride. Hugh was 34, fair-haired, with the kind of face that had always looked cheerful without apparent effort. Beside him stood two other groomsmen, and slightly apart at his left shoulder, Rafferty Stanhope. Rafferty was watching the chapel door with the fixed attention of someone who understood that the entrance was the moment everything changed. When Clara appeared in the doorway and the congregation drew a single collective breath, something crossed Rafferty's face, quiet, private, lasting only a heartbeat, and then settled back into stillness. She understood in that instant that this was not a man without feeling. He simply kept his feelings somewhere that required more effort to reach than most people were willing to expend. Rafferty had not wanted to come to the wedding. He had wanted to send Hugh a warm letter and a well-chosen gift along with his sincere regrets, citing a prior engagement that did not exist. He had drafted that letter twice and destroyed it twice because Hugh had written back before he finished. "Come. I want you there. You are the only person in this world, Raff, who was on my side before it mattered." That was the essence of Hugh Aldridge. He had a way of making the truth feel uncomplicated. So Rafferty had come to Derbyshire. He had been to Ashbourne Hall once before, as an 11-year-old boy visiting with his father on some estate matter long since forgotten. He remembered the lime trees in the drive, the sound the gravel made underfoot, and the particular quality of the lake in summer. He had not thought about any of it until the carriage turned off the main road, and it all returned at once, not in detail but in feeling, the way childhood places do. The wedding was exactly as it should be. Clara was radiant. Hugh was visibly overwhelmed in the way fundamentally good-humoured men become briefly undone when the thing they most desire arrives and reveals itself to be real. The vows were simple and heartfelt. Rafferty stood at Hugh's shoulder and listened and thought, with the precise objectivity of the uninvested observer, that this was what it truly was. Not the arrangement society organized and called marriage, the thing beneath it. The actual thing, the one that had nothing to do with station or convenience and everything to do with the particular quality of two people who had decided to see each other honestly. He did not think about himself in that context. He had learned over 3 years that it was not a productive use of his attention. After the ceremony came the wedding breakfast, and after the wedding breakfast came the ball, and at no point during any of it did Rafferty find himself the subject of any particular attention. He was introduced to perhaps 4 people, all of whom found their attention drawn elsewhere before the conversation could develop. He stood in the correct places and spoke when addressed and performed every groomsman duty with competence. Lady Constance Ravenscroft, who sat near him at the breakfast table, surveyed him once with the focused assessment of a woman who had spent 4 decades evaluating the social utility of people, and then did not look at him again. He did not mind. What he minded, if he allowed himself the word, was the particular quality of standing slightly outside the room, even when he was physically within it. He had felt it before. He had been feeling it, in varying degrees, since the inquiry. Since his name had appeared in reports, he was not given the opportunity to refute adequately, in language that said nothing precisely and implied everything efficiently. Since the regiment had arrived at the quiet understanding that he was not the sort of man one wanted, particularly close. He was not bitter, Bitterness required a belief that things should have been otherwise, and he had spent too many years in conditions that left no room for the luxury of should. But he did not pretend that it had left nothing behind. The scar at his temple was honest, healed to white and forgotten by his own face. The other marks were less obliging. He was standing beside the east column at the start of the fourth set when the Duchess crossed the floor toward him. He had noticed her at dinner the previous evening, not in the way one is struck by something, which involves noise and loss of equilibrium, but in the quieter way that things of genuine quality announce themselves, not loudly, not insistently, but with a persistence that made itself felt the longer the room continued. Her face had the particular quality of stillness that belonged to someone who had been unhappy and had decided not to become smaller because of it. Her eyes, when she had met his at breakfast that morning, were a deep and specific green, the color of glass held at an angle to river water on a bright day. She had not looked away quickly. He had been thinking about that small fact since breakfast and had not reached a satisfying conclusion about it. When she walked toward him now, he thought for a moment she was heading for someone standing behind him. She was not. She had declined Lord Hargreaves' invitation to dance at the start of the third set, citing tiredness she did not feel. It was not a lie precisely. She was tired of the specific effort of performing the version of herself that Constance had packed alongside the lavender dress. Constance had said, at some point in the carriage from London, that this party was an opportunity, that Genevieve had grieved adequately, that Lord Hargreave was an eminently practical consideration, that at 31, with no children and no particular claims on her future, she had the rare luxury of being able to choose well if she chose promptly. Genevieve had looked at the passing countryside and said nothing. She had come to Ashbourne for Clara, for the pleasure of watching a friend marry a man who deserved her. For 3 days in Derbyshire, away from the London house that still smelled in its corners of her husband's illness, a smell she had repainted over and aired out and replaced with flowers for 2 years, and could still locate in the early morning if she was quiet enough. She had not come to be assessed. But the evening was beautiful. The ballroom at Ashbourne Hall had been opened to its full extent, the summer air admitted from the terrace so that the candlelight moved in the warmth, very gently, like something breathing. The roses from the garden had been brought in for the night, and their scent mingled with the beeswax of the candles and the warm presence of a room full of people in movement. The musicians were excellent. She had watched Clara and Hugh dance the first set with the specific attentiveness of someone cataloguing joy for later reference, and had felt something in her chest that was not quite envy and not quite longing, but a combination of both, pressed into a feeling for which she had no precise name. Then the sets had continued, and the social machinery of the evening had reasserted itself, and Constance had appeared at her side. She stood with Constance and held her champagne and let the conversations flow around her. And at some point, she could not have said exactly when, only that the orchestra was playing something in 3/4 time that was more melancholy than the occasion technically required. She looked across the room and found the man beside the column. He was not watching her. He was watching the orchestra, his expression thoughtful in the way of someone who is genuinely listening rather than cataloguing. He had his hands behind his back, his weight easy on his feet, the particular stance of someone accustomed to waiting without impatience. The candles were warm behind him and threw the planes of his face into relief. The jaw, the slight angle of his nose, the old scar she had noted at breakfast, catching the light at a different angle now. His dark hair was slightly longer than strict fashion required, as if he had simply not attended to it with the usual anxiety. He was, in the candlelight and the gentle movement of the room around him, quietly, undeniably handsome in the way of a thing that does not announce itself and is therefore more present for it. No one was looking at him. That was the detail that decided her, not charity, not sentiment. She had no reason to cross a ballroom for a man she had spoken 5 words to, but she had spent 2 years allowing other people's comfort to determine the shape of her attention, and she was 31 years old, and the music was very beautiful, and she was tired of standing still while the world arranged itself around her convenience and called the arrangement safety. She handed her champagne to Constance, who took it without looking, and then looked immediately after her as she moved. The floor was wide, 30 feet, perhaps more. She was aware of the precise moment the room began to notice. It was a physics she had been subject to since she was 17, the ripple of attention that spread outward when something unexpected happened in the middle of a space. By the time she had crossed half the distance, the cone of quiet had formed. She did not look at it. She kept her eyes on the man beside the column, who had seen her coming when she was perhaps 8 feet away, and had made some internal decision before she stopped in front of him. She extended her hand, palm upward, emerald earrings catching the nearest candle. In the pause before he took it, a pause the length of a full breath, she thought she heard someone on the balcony say something in a very low voice. She did not look up. He took her hand. They stepped onto the floor together. The waltz had already been in motion. They moved into it the way two people do when neither of them is inclined to make more of a thing than it is, with care, without performance. His hand at her back was correct and firm, warm through the silk. Hers on his shoulder felt the contained steadiness of him. The quality she had been observing at a distance now made immediate and specific in the few inches of space between them. He did not speak immediately. She was grateful for it. She was aware of the eyes of the room upon them, not as pressure exactly, but as a weight that confirmed the reality of what was happening, the way one feels more certain of something when it is witnessed. When he spoke quietly, pitched beneath the music. "You knew what you were doing." "Yes," she said. A pause, measured in beats of the waltz. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. "Why?" he asked. Not with challenge, with the simple curiosity of someone who actually wanted to know. She considered it seriously, which the question deserved. She had been choosing the convenient answer for most of her adult life. She thought she might just now try the honest one. "Because no one else was going to," she said, "and it seemed to me that someone should." He was quiet for a moment, processing that with the same careful attention he appeared to give everything. Then, very slowly, something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite a smile, but the territory adjacent to one, held in careful reserve. It changed his face considerably. They danced the full set. She was aware through all of it of the specific physicality of the thing, not in a way that alarmed her, but in the way of noticing something one has not expected to notice. The warmth of his hand at her back, steady and present. The particular quality of moving with someone who was attentive to her direction without being stiff about it. There was an ease in him, a physical confidence that had nothing to do with display and everything to do with someone who had learned to occupy his body under conditions that did not permit uncertainty. His shoulder beneath her hand was solid and warm. When the music asked them to turn, she felt the small adjustment of his weight, exactly right, that kept them in alignment without effort. They were not performing. That was the quality she had not expected. Every other dance she had attended in the past decade had contained, for her, an element of performance, the correct posture, the appropriate expression, the management of what was visible and what was withheld. This was simply two people moving through music together, and it was, she thought, the most uncomplicated thing she had done in a very long time. The 100 eyes watched from the gallery and the edges of the room. Constance's expression, had Genevieve turned to look, would have been everything she expected. She did not turn. She kept her eyes on his face, and his face was worth looking at. The music ended. She became aware again of the room, the weight of it, the eyes, the heat of the candles, the cool air threading in from the open terrace, the particular charged silence of people who had witnessed something and were currently composing their response to it. He stepped back and bowed with the formality the occasion required. She curtsied. "Thank you, Mr. Stanhope," she said. "Thank you, Your Grace." His voice was even and low. "It was not what I expected of this evening." "Good, not expected," she said, "or other varieties." The corner of his mouth moved again, that held-back quality she was already beginning to understand as his version of warmth, deployed with the economy of someone who does not waste it. "I haven't yet determined which," he said. "I'll require more information." He escorted her back to the edge of the room, which was more than the situation required, and less than what some part of her had, without warning, begun to hope for. Then he inclined his head, once, and moved in the direction of the terrace doors. She stood where he had left her. She held herself very still and thought about that exchange for perhaps 30 seconds. Then Lady Constance materialized at her left shoulder with the precision of a woman who had been calculating her moment. "Genevieve." Her voice carried no inflection whatsoever. That was how Constance communicated the most serious things, by removing all register until the words arrived like objects placed on a table, cold and exact. What on earth was that? "A dance," Genevieve said. "He is a third son without estate or income, and a reputation the army took some lengths to distance itself from." "Lord Hargreave, I am going to get some air," Genevieve said pleasantly, and went to the terrace before Constance could form the rest of the sentence. The night air was cool and soft, smelling of the rose garden and, further off, the lake. A few other guests occupied the far end of the terrace. She could hear voices and the occasional laugh, the glow of a cheroot somewhere in the dark. She walked the other way toward the stone balustrade where the terrace looked over the south garden, and stood in the quiet with her hands resting on the cool stone. She heard him before she saw him. A very slight sound, the shift of weight on old stone perhaps, or simply the quality of the dark being different in one direction than another. He was standing further along the balustrade, looking down at the darkened garden below. She considered going back inside. The sensible thing was to go back inside. She walked toward him. He turned when she was close enough. "I would not have thought," he said, "that you were a woman who walked toward difficult situations of her own free will." "Then you have not been paying sufficient attention," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned back to look at the garden. She stood beside him. The roses were dark shapes in the moonlight, the paths between them traced in silver, the whole prospect very still and very English, and smelling of something green and living underneath the floral sweetness. "I expect," he said at length, "that I'm about to be advised that the dance was pleasant, but the implications are rather awkward." "You expect incorrectly," she said. "I'm about to ask you a question, if you will permit it." He looked at her. In the dark, he was a more human thing than in the ballroom, less an object of social observation, more simply a man standing in the night air beside an old stone house looking at a garden he had no particular claim on. The scar at his temple caught a little of the light from the windows behind her. "Ask," he said. "How long have you been content to be overlooked?" The silence afterward was longer than she had expected. She let it be. He looked at his hands on the stone rail. Large hands, steady. A working man's hands, she thought, in a setting that had not asked for the working to be visible. Then he said, "I am not certain content is accurate." "No," she agreed, "but you have accepted it. That is what I am asking." "Why?" He turned and looked at her fully. His eyes in the dark were the color of very deep amber, the kind that holds light inside itself rather than reflecting it back. There was something in them that was not quite wariness and not quite hope, but the possibility of the second fighting its way through the long habit of the first. Because making noise about it, he said, would have required a belief that the arrangement was wrong. And I stopped being entirely certain of that some time ago. She heard in those words the outline of something large and old and not fully healed. She did not pursue it. She simply looked at him and said, "I think you are wrong about that." He said nothing, but something in his expression shifted, very slightly, in the direction of being willing to consider the possibility. They stood in the dark for another 20 minutes. What they spoke about was not remarkable on the surface. The quality of the musicians, Clara's happiness, what Derbyshire looked like in seasons other than this one. He had been stationed in several different counties across his years, and he described the specific quality of each one's light in winter with the precision of someone who had learned to find comfort in the observable, in the particular and the real, rather than the abstract. She found she wanted to ask him more. She found she had questions she had not known she was holding until the conversation offered them a door. He asked her about the Duke's house, whether she had returned to her family after the death or remained in London. She told him she had stayed. The house was hers now, technically. She had not yet decided whether it would remain so. She had been deciding very carefully about everything, she said, for a very long time. She thought she might be ready to begin deciding differently. He had looked at her then, in the particular way of someone receiving a statement that contained more information than its surface, and choosing to hold that information with appropriate care rather than reaching for it immediately. She respected the restraint of it. When the cold finally threaded more definitely into the night air, she said she should go in. He said he would follow in a moment. She walked back through the terrace doors, carrying something she could not have named and would not have wanted to put down. She woke early. The house was not yet fully awake around her. She could hear the distant industry of the lower floors, the sound of kitchens beginning their day. The morning light through her curtains was the pale, clear gold of very early August, the color of the world before it had accumulated the day's expectations. She lay still and thought about the previous evening. She was not, by nature or training, a woman who acted on impulse. She had been trained out of it at 12 and had not particularly fought the lesson because it had seemed at the time to make sense. There are consequences to public actions. People watch. What you do is legible to everyone around you, whether you intend it to be or not. Last night she had crossed a ballroom floor in front of 100 people because something in a quiet man, standing alone beside a column, had called to something in her that she had not previously known was listening. She turned the decision over in her mind carefully, the way one examines an unfamiliar object, looking at every angle before committing to an assessment. She felt no regret. That was the part that surprised her most. She dressed and went down. The breakfast room contained 3 other guests, none of them Constance and none of them Rafferty Stanhope. She poured her tea and sat and allowed the morning to be what it was, without assigning it any additional significance. Constance arrived 20 minutes later, carrying the compressed expression of a woman who had been composing her remarks since before the household was awake. She accepted her tea. She waited until the other guests were occupied. "Lord Hargreave," she said in a voice of studied neutrality, "has communicated that he will not be present for the final evening. A business matter requires him in London." "That is unfortunate for him," Genevieve said. Genevieve. Constance set down her cup. "You understand what last night appeared to be?" "A dance," Genevieve said. "Our declaration, in front of everyone present, to a man who has nothing to offer you and a good deal associated with him that reflects poorly on anyone who stands near him for any length of time." Genevieve looked at her aunt by marriage. She had known Constance for 12 years. She was fond of her in the complicated way that one is fond of a person who has always been both useful and unkind, who has meant well, consistently, in ways that cost other people. She owed Constance something. She did not owe her this. "I danced with a man at a ball," she said, "once. You crossed the room to him, publicly." "Yes." "In front of Lord Hargreave and every family of consequence in the county." "Yes," she said again. Constance's silence was the kind that had reached the edge of its jurisdiction and knew it. In the stables, some time after breakfast, Hugh Aldridge found Rafferty checking over the horses with the systematic attention he brought to any task he could do himself, rather than delegate. "Half of them," Hugh said, leaning against the stall door with his morning coffee, "are calling you the most fortunate man in Derbyshire. And the other half—" Rafferty did not look up from the harness he was inspecting, deeply and comprehensively confused. "That seems about right." Hugh was quiet for a moment. Then, in the tone he reserved for things that mattered, "Raff, are you all right?" Rafferty straightened. He considered the question the way he considered everything, without hurry, without performance. "I don't know," he said, and because it was Hugh who had not required him to be certain about anything since the inquiry, "I think I may not be indifferent to her." "Good," Hugh said, "because she is quite visibly not indifferent to you, which the entire county has now observed." Rafferty looked at the horse for a long moment. "It is not straightforward." "Nothing that is worth it," Hugh said, "ever is." Which was the kind of thing Hugh said and which Rafferty could not on this occasion reasonably dispute. It was at luncheon, the second day, that she heard it. 14 guests at the table. The conversation had moved, as conversations at long country house luncheons will, through several distinct territories. The parliamentary session, a new exhibition at the Crystal Palace, the question of railway expansion into Wales. Sir Frederick Marlowe, who had arrived that morning as a late addition to the party, was seated 4 places from Rafferty on the opposite side of the table. Sir Frederick was 50 or thereabouts, lean in the way of men who have maintained military bearing past the age when it requires effort, with light eyes and a very composed face. He had greeted Rafferty when they were introduced with a pleasantness that had lasted precisely long enough to note the presence of witnesses. The conversation had drifted to the Indian campaigns. Someone mentioned the name of a regiment. Sir Frederick, who had been listening with the expression of a man tracking something he was waiting to introduce, turned his gaze briefly toward Rafferty's end of the table. "The Stanhope business," he said, to no one in particular, in the conversational tone of someone depositing something they knew others would pick up. "Dreadful affair. I believe the regiment never fully recovered its standing afterward." The table shifted, one of those small seismic adjustments where nothing explicit had occurred but something had, unambiguously. Rafferty said nothing. He reached for his water glass with the absolute stillness of a man who had decided, before the sentence was finished, not to respond. Genevieve, from her end of the table, heard every word. She also watched Rafferty's face in the moment they landed, the settlement of absolute stillness over it, the way one watches a shutter close. Not guilt, not embarrassment. The specific stillness of a man exercising a very old decision not to give another person the satisfaction of a reaction. "What regiment?" asked one of the younger guests, with the honest curiosity of someone who had not heard the name before. Sir Frederick smiled with the pleasantness of a man who had achieved the thing he wanted. "A northern regiment, some years back. A matter of an officer leaving his position during a difficult engagement, never satisfactorily resolved as I understand it." His light eyes moved very briefly to Rafferty, then away. These things rarely are. After luncheon, Constance found her on the landing with the satisfied air of a woman who had been waiting to have a particular conversation. "I imagine," Constance said, "that you will have questions about what was said at table." She had, in fact, been thinking about little else for the past 40 minutes. "Tell me," she said. "He was accused," Constance said, 3 years ago of abandoning his position during an engagement in the Indian campaign. His men were cut off. 2 were injured. There was a formal inquiry." A pause, precise as punctuation. "He was not formally censured, but the inquiry produced no exoneration either. The regiment found it preferable for him to resign his commission quietly, without fuss. These things are managed better that way." Genevieve heard the words and arranged them around the image of Rafferty Stanhope reaching for his water glass at a luncheon table, with the contained economy of a man who had spent 3 years learning that responding gives the other person exactly what they want. "Thank you," she said. She went to her room. She sat by the window and looked at the south garden. The afternoon light was long and warm, bending through the elm trees at the edge of the lawn in the way of late summer light that was beginning, only just, to understand that it would not last indefinitely. She held the information Constance had given her, the way one holds something heavier than it appeared, taking its full weight before deciding what to do with it. She thought about the garden and the moonlight on the roses, and his voice saying, "I stopped being entirely certain that it was wrong." She thought about the serving spoon at breakfast, repositioned because someone else would need it. She thought about the quality of his attention when she had offered her hand, not the attention of a man performing the response to an unexpected honor, but the attention of a man making a real calculation and choosing after it to trust what he found. She was not certain of many things, but she was quite certain that the man she had spoken with on the terrace was not the story Sir Frederick Marlowe had just deposited at a luncheon table for the benefit of an audience. She stayed at the window until the light changed. She found him in the library the following afternoon. She had not gone looking for him. She had gone because the afternoon had clouded over, and the drawing room was occupied by a card party in which she had no interest, and she wanted to sit somewhere quiet with a book and not be required to present any version of herself to anyone. He was at the far end, near the window that looked onto the north lawn, with a volume she could not discern the spine of from the doorway. He looked up when she entered. Neither of them left. She chose something from the shelf nearest the door without particular care, and settled into the armchair by the cold fireplace. The library was the kind of old room that had absorbed decades of weather and reflection into its walls, close, warm, smelling of paper and leather, and the quiet passage of time. Outside, the light was grey and soft. The north lawn was still. They occupied the room in the general shape of reading for perhaps 10 minutes before she spoke. "Mr. Stanhope." She kept her eyes on the page. "I heard something said at luncheon yesterday that I have been thinking about since." A pause. "I expect you did. I expect you know what I will ask." "I expect so," he said. He closed his book. He did not set it down. He held it. The quality of a man who uses objects to help him remain still, when being still is the more effortful choice. "You want to know whether it is true?" "Yes." He was quiet. The grey light moved slightly outside, a cloud shifting over a brightness that was not quite sun. The library brightened for a moment, and then settled again. "No," he said, "it is not true. In the way that most things that are not true are not inventions, they are misreadings. There was a position, there was an engagement that went badly. I made a decision that I believed, and still believe, was the correct one given what I knew at the time. One of my colleagues believed otherwise. That colleague had a closer friendship with the inquiry board than I had." He paused. "It was not complicated in the end. It was only ordinary." He said it without heat, without the quality of a man presenting a rehearsed defense. It was the quality of a man stating what happened and letting it sit in the room as what it was. "You chose not to fight it," she said. "I chose not to perform a contest I could not win." He looked at her. "That is a different thing." "Is it?" "Yes." A long pause. "Fighting requires an audience that is willing to hear. The audience available to me was not. There is no dishonor in recognizing that noise is not the same as the truth. That spending yourself in a public argument you cannot win only diminishes the truth further, by associating it with desperation." She looked at him across the quiet room. The steadiness of him, the quality of a person who had made a certain peace with something, not because it stopped hurting, but because they decided, at some specific and private point, that the wound would not be permitted to govern them. "Why did you come here?" she asked. "To this party. You knew someone like Sir Frederick Marlowe might be present." A long pause, long enough that she was not certain he would answer. The fireplace, unlit, had a smell of old ash and stone. "Because Hugh asked me," he said, "and because I am tired of allowing other people's comfort to determine the limits of my own." She heard that with a precision that had nothing to do with language. She heard it with the specific sharpness of a woman who had been allowing other people's comfort to determine the shape of her own life for a decade, in her marriage, in her mourning, in the green travelling dress and the lavender silk, and every choice made to manage the anxiety of everyone else in the room, while her own remained neatly folded and unreferenced. "That," she said carefully, "seems like very good reasoning." Something changed in the room. Not the light, the quality of the air between two people when something true had been said, and both of them recognized it simultaneously, and neither was quite prepared for the weight of the recognition. They talked for an hour, not about the inquiry, about other things. A book she had read the previous winter that he had also read and had a different view of. She had found the protagonist's choices rational. He had found them expedient, which he said was different, which they had then disagreed about vigorously and pleasurably for a good 10 minutes, neither of them conceding any ground. She could not remember the last time she had argued about a book with someone who held the opposite view, and was glad of it. The argument had the quality of exercise, her mind engaging in something it had not been permitted to do in a very long time. About the hawk they could both see from the window, hunting above the north meadow, with the absolute focused economy of a thing that knew precisely what it needed, and had no interest in anything beyond it. They had watched it together in silence for a minute or two, and she had felt the quality of the shared attention, the ease of being beside someone without requiring the silence to mean something or be filled. About what 2 years of widowhood had looked like from the inside. She had not described it to anyone in any terms other than satisfactory or managed or very well, thank you. She found herself in this room, in this grey afternoon, with this specific man holding a closed book and looking at her as if he had time, describing it honestly, the particular loneliness of it, the way people looked at her with the expectation of a grief she did not have, and the guilt that expectation produced, the strange freedom at the edges of it, the strange constriction at its center. He listened with the kind of attention that did not immediately produce a response, the most useful kind, she had always thought, the kind that allowed the thing said to remain what it was for a moment before anything was layered over it. About what Derbyshire looked like in winter, which he had never seen, and which she described on the basis of a painting she had encountered once, whose origin she could no longer identify. He said he would like to see it. She said it was worth seeing. Neither of them said what the other was clearly thinking. It was, she thought, walking back through the corridors at 4 o'clock with the afternoon light lying gold and low across the stone floors, the most honest conversation she had had in a very long time. She felt, stepping back into the ordinary machinery of the house like herself, entirely, unexpectedly herself. He told Hugh on the morning of the third day. They were in the billiard room. Clara and the rest of the party were occupied elsewhere, a walking expedition to the lake that Rafferty had declined without being pressed. Hugh was not playing billiards. He was sitting on the edge of the table with his arms folded, and the expression of a man waiting for a conversation he already knew the shape of. Rafferty moved around the room with the economical restlessness of someone thinking through something while his body performed the perimeter work. Hugh watched him. "I'm going to leave tomorrow," Rafferty said. "A day early." Hugh said nothing for a long moment. "Why?" "You know why. I want to hear you say it. I want—" Rafferty stopped moving. He looked at the baize surface of the table, at the neat triangle of balls sitting in the arrangement that no one had broken. "Because she does not need this. What people are saying. Being compared to Hargreave and everything else attached to me. She has been out of society for 2 years and she is finding her footing again, and I am—" He stopped. "Not what?" Hugh's voice was quiet. "Not what anyone would choose for her," Rafferty said, "if they had the choosing." "You are not choosing for her," Hugh said. "No, but I am removing the complication before it becomes one she has to manage." "That," Hugh said, "is the most elegantly stated version of running away I have encountered." He unfolded his arms. "She is not a woman who needs protection from complications. I have known Genevieve since she was 17 years old, and the thing that has always been most true about her is that she is entirely capable of determining what is good for her. She crossed a ballroom floor in front of 100 people, Raff, and she has spent 3 days doing nothing to suggest she found the crossing regrettable. And when the season begins, and the whispers follow her from it, then she will manage them, as she has managed everything else that has been placed in her way." Hugh looked at him steadily. "She is not a woman who needs managing. She has had quite enough of that." Rafferty said nothing. He was aware, with the precision of someone who does not often feel things he cannot name, that Hugh was correct. He was also aware that the fact of Hugh being correct did not change what he was going to do, which was a particular kind of honesty about himself he did not find comfortable. "You're going to leave anyway," Hugh said. "It was not a question. I think it is better." "Leave her a way back to you, at least," Hugh said. "Don't disappear entirely." Rafferty thought about that for the rest of the afternoon, and did not find an answer to it that satisfied him. Clara told Genevieve at breakfast the following morning, the final morning of the party, with the careful gentleness of a woman delivering news she knew would produce a response that the recipient would not wish to display in a breakfast room. "He leaves this morning," Clara said. She looked at Genevieve with the directness of a long friendship. "He told Hugh last night, early departure." Genevieve's teacup was halfway to her mouth. She set it down. The morning light was the brightest it had been all week, coming through the east windows in long warm bars across the tablecloth. "Did he give a reason?" she asked. She was very calm. "He said he had been away long enough." Genevieve looked at the window for a moment. The garden beyond it was very gold and very still. Then she set down her napkin. "Excuse me," she said. She left the room without additional explanation. He had packed the previous night. The trunk was already in the entrance hall when he came downstairs at 7:30. He had one bag remaining, a leather case that held papers, correspondence, a few things that had no category but needed to travel with him. He was sorting through it at the small writing table when he found the letter. He had been composing it to Hugh for the better part of a year. Not a letter exactly, Several pages written in the compressed hand he had developed in the field over many years. Small, precise, efficient. The hand of someone who had learned that space on a page, like everything else, was a resource to be managed. The pages contained everything he had been unable to say about the inquiry in the years since it closed. Not a defense, not an appeal. A true accounting. The names, the decisions, the exact sequence of what had happened in the engagement. The kind of account that required silence and certainty that the person receiving it was someone who deserved the full truth and would not use it as currency in any transaction he was not party to. He had written it for Hugh because Hugh was the only person he wanted to have it, not for any official purpose, not to be used, simply to be known accurately by one person who mattered to him. He sealed it. He wrote Hugh's name on the outside and set it on the writing table and went to check on the trunk. He did not see the footman take it. The footman was young, recently arrived from the village, still learning the house's geography and the specific logic of its routines. He had been given instructions to collect any correspondence from the guest rooms for the morning post. He had understood this to mean all sealed letters on writing surfaces. He had come to Rafferty's room, found the envelope and carried it downstairs in a bundle with 3 other letters, and had then found himself uncertain about which receiving hall pigeonhole corresponded to which guest. The house had too many of them, and he was still learning, and had set the bundle on the silver salver in the corridor outside the blue suite, while he went to ask Mrs. Aldridge's housekeeper for clarification. The blue suite was Genevieve's. She found the letters on the salver when she came back along the corridor, moving quickly in the direction of the stables, and not in that moment attending to anything she was passing. Her own name was on the top letter. She picked up the bundle. And then she saw Hugh Aldridge's name on the sealed letter beneath, and beneath Hugh's name a handwriting, small, compressed, precise, with the quality of a hand that had been trained toward efficiency so long that it had become a character of its own. She was not a person who read other people's correspondence. She stood in the corridor for a moment, the bundle in her hands, and then she went into the blue suite and opened the letter. She read it standing at the window where the morning light was clearest. It took her 12 minutes, 7 pages closely written, naming everything with the specific precision of someone who had decided that accuracy was the only remaining form of justice available to him. It named the engagement, the decision, the 2 men who survived it, the alternative that would have produced a different outcome with different costs. It named the colleague who had spoken at the inquiry. It named what Rafferty had chosen not to say and why, and what that choice had cost him. It said in the penultimate paragraph, in a sentence she read twice, "I do not need to be believed. I need you to have it. I need one person to hold the accurate version of what happened, not because it changes anything, but because truth left entirely alone tends to become something else over time, and I would rather it not." She refolded the pages with great care. She held the sealed envelope for a moment between both hands, then set it precisely back in the bundle. She was aware of her own breathing, steady when she had not expected it to be. She thought about everything she had already known before she read it. She thought about what reading it had added. Not new information, precisely. The shape of the information made visible. The outline of a man who had made a choice at great personal cost and had then declined, with complete consistency, to frame that cost as a sacrifice, because framing it would have been a kind of self-pity, and self-pity would have diminished both the choice and the cost. She picked up her shawl from the chair. She walked out the door. The stables were around the east side of the house, sheltered by a curved stone wall from the north wind. She walked quickly across the south lawn, where the grass was still silvered with early dew, the hem of her morning dress darkening with it. The morning was clear and fully bright, the best morning Derbyshire had offered all week, the light falling on the stone and the gardens with the particular quality of a day that intended to be generous. She heard the horses before she rounded the wall. Then she came through the gate into the stable-yard and saw him. He was checking the harness himself. Of course he was. Talking quietly to the groom who held the lead horse, running his hand along the traces with the systematic attention of someone who trusted his own inspection more than delegation. Not from arrogance, she understood now, but from the deeply ingrained habit of a man who had learned that the things done carefully at the beginning determined what was possible later. His hat was already on. His coat was already buttoned. His bag was already by the yard gate. He was, in all respects, ready to leave. He saw her when he straightened. The expression that crossed his face was rapid and complex. Something warm, and then something more careful layered over it, and then the careful quality held, though the warm one did not entirely disappear. He said nothing. The groom looked between them and found something to occupy himself with on the far side of the horse. She pushed open the gate and walked across the yard, straw and cobblestone, the smell of horse and morning and something green from the fields beyond the wall. She stopped 3 feet from him. "You were going to leave without saying goodbye," she said. "I thought it was better." "For whom?" He did not answer. She saw the consideration in his face, the calculation of what to say that would be both true and kind, which she was beginning to understand was the calculation he made about nearly everything. "I read your letter," she said. "The one meant for Hugh. The footman misdelivered it. I am not sorry," she added before he could speak. "I know that I ought to say I am. I find that I am not." The stable yard was very quiet. The horse shifted. The sound of the house distant settled to birdsong and the creak of something in the wind. His face had gone completely still. "Then you know," he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "I knew before I read it. The letter only gave me the shape of it exactly." She paused. "You are leaving because you have decided I need to be protected from the inconvenience of being associated with you." He did not deny it. "I do not need protecting," she said. "I have spent a very long time being managed and sheltered and guided toward the most convenient version of my own life, and I am finished with it. I am 31 years old, and I crossed a ballroom floor in front of 100 people because I chose to, and I went to the terrace because I chose to, and I am standing in a stable yard in damp grass before breakfast because I choose to be here." She looked at him. "I do not require you to make my choices for me." The morning light lay full and warm across the stone of the yard. No shadows at this hour, everything visible. "Genevieve," he said. "Not your Grace, not Duchess. Her name." Said the way a person says the name of someone they had decided to stop pretending they were indifferent to. Not with ceremony, without performance, with the simple weight of a thing that was true and had been true for longer than either of them had acknowledged out loud. She felt it the way you feel a thing that had been quietly building somewhere behind your ordinary awareness and had simply at last arrived. "Stay," she said. "One more day, and then we will see what is possible." He held her gaze. The careful calculation in his eyes moved through its work. She could almost trace it, the familiar process, the assessment of risk and consequence and what was warranted. And then, very slowly, something in it shifted, not the absence of caution, the decision to extend it differently, to allow that the calculation on this occasion might produce a different answer than it had always produced before. She held very still. She had learned in the past 3 days that pushing was not what he responded to. Waiting was. He was a man who required the space to arrive at his own conclusions, not because he was slow, but because his conclusions, when he reached them, were his own and not performances of what someone else had needed him to feel. The silence in the stable yard stretched. A bird called somewhere beyond the wall. The morning smelled of horses and summer grass and stones still cool from the night. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that she had not been aware of it in years, as a real thing, rapid, present, indicating something that was happening rather than something that was being managed. He turned to the groom. "Tell them I will not need the carriage this morning after all." The groom nodded with the studied neutrality of a man in his profession and led the horse back toward the stable, his footsteps receding until the yard was very quiet. Rafferty looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved in that way she had memorized without meaning to over 3 days. The held warmth, the specific register of it that she now understood, was not restraint, but precision. He was precise about what he felt. He did not offer it carelessly, which meant that when he offered it she could trust what it was. She looked at the gate and the south lawn beyond it, dew silver and wide, and the Derbyshire hills lying gold and hazy in the early light, and felt something she had no name for and no desire to require one of. Clara saw them from the breakfast-room window. She set down her coffee cup and rested her chin in her hand and watched the two of them walk back across the south lawn, not touching, 3 feet apart, no outward declaration, the morning light full across the grass between them. There was in the image nonetheless something that required no explanation, the quality of two people who were still moving carefully around each other, but had made, without announcement, the decision to stop being afraid. Hugh came to stand beside her. "Well," he said. "Yes," Clara said. They watched until the two figures rounded the corner of the house and disappeared. Lady Constance Ravenscroft departed Ashbourne Hall that afternoon, one day before the formal end of the party, citing an engagement in London that had not previously been mentioned. Genevieve helped her with her final arrangements and embraced her at the carriage door with genuine warmth. "I am grateful," Genevieve said, "for everything you intended." It was the most honest form of thank you she had available. Constance looked at her for a long moment, with the expression of a woman arriving at a conclusion she had not anticipated and did not quite dislike. "You are a stubborn woman," she said. "I know," Genevieve said. "Your mother would have been proud of you," Constance said, and got into the carriage and said nothing further. The last afternoon at Ashbourne passed the way the best days do, without urgency, in the long golden hours that August provided when it had decided to be generous. There was no more dancing. There was a walk to the lake in the late afternoon, a small group of them, and she found herself beside him at the water's edge, watching the light break apart into copper on the surface. They spoke about very little, and it was, unreasonably, entirely sufficient. He did not try to say anything grand. She did not require it. What was said by the quality of standing beside each other at a lakeside in Derbyshire while the day turned, and being, for the first time in longer than either of them had counted, not alone in it. 6 weeks later in London he came to call. The weather had changed. September had arrived with the particular efficiency of a season that had no patience for lingering warmth and had declined to offer any. The city smelled of coal smoke and damp stone and the specific interior quality of houses that had been closed against summer and were only just beginning to admit the autumn. She had been in London a fortnight, having returned from a week with her sister in Wiltshire, a week in which she had been asked with great kindness and very little tact approximately 6 times what her intentions were regarding the situation at Ashbourne. She had told her sister, truthfully, that she did not yet know. That was less true by the time she got back to London. It was not true at all by the end of the first week home. The front parlour was a different room in grey morning light, smaller, more domestic, the chintz covers on the chairs looking rather more faded than they had in summer. She was in the middle of rearranging those chairs when the footman announced him. She had been meaning to deal with them since January and had been tolerating the wrong arrangement on the basis that it did not matter enough to address. She had decided sometime in the previous 10 days to stop tolerating things on the basis that they did not matter enough. He was shown in. He had his hat in his hands. He looked very well, less formal than he had been at Ashbourne. The contained carefulness of a guest in someone else's house slightly eased, something in his bearing that was marginally more at home with itself. She thought it suited him. "You have moved the chairs," he said. "I am moving the chairs," she corrected. "They have been wrong since the upholsterer came in January, and I have been tolerating the wrongness, and I have decided to stop." He looked at the room with the expression of someone who had an opinion and was determining whether to offer it. The blue one, he said, was better where it was. She turned and looked at him. He met her gaze with the quality she had spent 6 weeks thinking about, the steadiness, the held warmth, the slight movement at the corner of his mouth that was already becoming legible to her as a specific frequency of feeling. The blue chair, she said, was positioned so that anyone sitting in it received the afternoon light directly in their eyes. "It does," he allowed. "You are correct about the light." He paused, considering. "I will concede the light if you will concede the angle to the fireplace." "You have not sat in that chair in winter," she said. "You have no information about what the angle to the fireplace requires." "No," he said, "I have not." He said it with the quiet quality of a thing being placed on a mantelpiece for later, a fact set carefully aside to be returned to when the time was right. She felt the warmth of it precisely. "Then perhaps," she said, "you had better come back in December and find out for yourself." He looked at her steadily. "I fully intend to," he said. She turned back to the blue chair and moved it 3 inches to the left, and the afternoon light fell across the upholstery at exactly the angle she had intended, warm and clear, and very good, as it turned out, at showing the color properly. "You are very opinionated about furniture, Mr. Stanhope," she said over her shoulder. "I'm very opinionated," he said, "about everything that matters to me, Your Grace." A pause, the light on the blue chair, the sound of London outside rearranging itself around an ordinary Wednesday afternoon, a cart on the cobbles, a vendor's voice somewhere down the street, the regular, unremarkable music of a city that did not know or care what was happening inside this particular front parlor, between these 2 particular people, on this particular afternoon. She turned to face him. He was standing 3 feet from her, hat still in hand, very still in the way that she now knew was not stillness from absence, but from the presence of something contained. The afternoon light fell across one side of his face. There was no scar visible from this angle. There was only the face of a man who had spent 3 years being ordinary, in a world that had decided he was not worth attending to, and who was standing in her front parlor in September, holding his hat because she had not yet invited him to put it down. "Sit down, Mr. Stanhope," she said. He looked at her. A flicker of something warm crossed his face, warm and faintly amused, and, underneath both of those, something more serious and more real. He sat in the blue chair. The afternoon light fell on him at exactly the correct angle. "Well," she said, "now you know about the light." "I do," he said. "You were entirely right." "I frequently am," she said, "about things that matter." He looked at her steadily. "Yes," he said. "I have begun to understand that." She sat in the chair opposite and poured the tea the footman had left and handed him his cup, and he accepted it with the care of a man who understood that some things deserved to be received properly, and outside on the London street the ordinary afternoon continued its ordinary business, and inside the room something that was neither ordinary nor in any hurry settled itself between them like something coming home. "Then I suppose," she said, "that I shall simply have to bear it. Every duchess has a story the world forgot to ask about."